welcome to the channel. In this video, we're uncovering every execution carried out across the United States during March of 2025. Who were these prisoners? What crimes sealed their fate? And what were their final words, their last meals, and their final moments? From death row to the execution chamber, we walk you through every case in March. This is every execution in America, and the stories behind them. On March 7, 2025, after 23 years on death row, Brad Keith Sigmon was executed by firing squad at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, marking the first such execution in the U.S. since 2010. On the afternoon of April 27, 2001, David and Gladys Lark were at home in Greenville County, South Carolina, unaware that their daughter's former boyfriend had arrived with a weapon and a plan. Hours earlier, Brad Sigmon had decided he would punish Rebecca Barbera for ending their relationship, and her parents would pay the price first. Armed with a wooden baseball bat, Sigmon entered the Larks' home. What followed was not an outburst, but a prolonged, brutal, double murder. Sigmon first attacked David Lark, striking him repeatedly in the head. Gladys tried to escape or intervene but was also beaten to death with multiple blows. The forensic pathologist later testified that both victims suffered extensive cranial fractures and signs of prolonged blunt force trauma, suggesting that neither died instantly. Sigmon didn't flee. Instead, he waited for Rebecca to arrive. When she returned home that night, he abducted her at gunpoint and forced her into a vehicle. Over the next few hours, she persuaded him not to harm her. Eventually, he let her out and drove away. The Larks' bodies were discovered shortly afterward. The scene was described as domestic but catastrophic. Blood spatter across the walls, defensive wounds on both victims, and no evidence of forced entry. Police quickly identified Sigmon as the suspect. Sigmon eluded police for 11 days. He was captured on May 8, 2001, in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. In his possession were multiple weapons, personal belongings of Rebecca Barbera, and notes that investigators described as rambling but targeted. At trial, the evidence was both direct and overwhelming. Forensic blood analysis matched the victims. Fingerprints placed Sigmon inside the Larks' home. The baseball bat was located and confirmed as the murder weapon. No alternate suspects were identified. More damning than the physical evidence was Sigmon's own admission. In court, he stated, "I am guilty," in front of the jury. He made no effort to deflect blame, but also offered no detailed explanation. He confessed without a fight, but was that confession a sign of remorse or defeat? The prosecution presented the case as a calculated act of revenge. They focused on aggravating factors: 2 victims, a weapon of prolonged pain, and a murder committed during a burglary. They argued that the crimes were slow, deliberate, and physically torturous. The defense team conceded guilt, but fought to spare Sigmon's life. They presented records of drug addiction, mental illness, and a long history of emotional instability. Psychiatrists diagnosed him with major depressive disorder and possible suicidal ideation. According to testimony, he had told friends he planned to kill Rebecca and then himself, but couldn't follow through. The jury sentenced him to death on July 20, 2002. A separate conviction for burglary resulted in a 30-year sentence. His direct appeal was denied in 2005. His final federal habeas petition was rejected in 2023. In 2021, the state lacked the means to carry out a lethal injection, delaying the execution. After legal and logistical issues were resolved, the South Carolina Supreme Court scheduled his execution for March 7, 2025. Sigmon chose to die by firing squad. Sigmon's final meal was unremarkable in its familiarity, but carefully chosen. Fried chicken from KFC, green beans, mashed potatoes with brown gravy, buttermilk biscuits, cheesecake, sweet tea. He ate alone in silence and left nothing unfinished. Prison staff reported no unusual behavior in his final hours. Sigmon remained calm and quiet. There were no signs of visible distress, resistance, or religious rituals. He declined to speak publicly in the chamber, but wrote a final statement, which was read by his attorney. In it, Sigmon emphasized Christian compassion. "To my fellow Christians, I call on you to help us end the death penalty. Not because I say so, but because Christ does. Not under the law of Moses, but under the grace of the New Testament." He did not address the victims' families directly, nor did he apologize or explain his actions. There were no tears, no final pleas. He simply waited for the process to begin. At 6 p.m., Sigmund was escorted to the execution chamber. He was secured to a metal chair with restraint belts around his arms, legs, and chest. A circular target was placed over his heart. A leather hood covered his head. 15 feet away, behind a curtain, 3 trained prison staff members each took aim with .308 caliber rifles. Only one rifle contained a blank, so no one would know who fired the fatal shot. At precisely 6:07 p.m., all 3 shooters pulled their triggers simultaneously. Witnesses reported hearing a single, unified crack. Sigmund's body jolted slightly and then slumped forward. There was no audible sound from him. He was pronounced dead at 6:08 p.m. The autopsy confirmed the bullets had punctured the heart and lungs. Death was rapid. No medical intervention was required. He died without a word, but what did his silence mean? Submission, defiance, or something in between? Just 11 days later, the United States would witness another first, this time pointing toward the future of execution protocols. On March 19, 2025, after more than 20 years on Arizona's death row, Aaron Brian Gunches was executed by lethal injection at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, following years of legal waivers and repeated personal requests for his own execution. In November 2002, a conflict between 2 people spiraled into a calculated killing in the Arizona desert. The victim was 42-year-old Ted Price, a father, ex-husband, and former partner of Catherine Letcher. The man who murdered him was Letcher's new boyfriend, Aaron Brian Gunches. The motive began with custody, drug use, and control. According to court records, Price had grown increasingly concerned about Letcher's methamphetamine use around their children. During an argument, he threatened to contact Child Protective Services. Hours later, Letcher made a call to Gunches. The exact words she used were disputed, but according to testimony, she asked him to take care of it. Gunches, accompanied by an acquaintance, offered to drive Price to a bus station in Phoenix under the pretense of helping him leave town. But the plan quickly changed. Realizing they didn't have enough money to purchase a ticket, Gunches diverted the car into a remote section of desert near Mesa. There was no struggle, no warning. Gunches pulled out a firearm and shot Price 4 times. The shots were deliberate and tightly grouped. 2 in the torso, 1 to the back, and a final round to the head. The angle of the headshot, slightly downward and behind the ear, suggested close range and control, not panic or accident. Ballistics later confirmed the weapon used in the murder matched the gun Gunches would use 2 months later to shoot a state trooper during an unrelated traffic stop. The body was left in the open. No effort was made to conceal it. Price's wallet and identification were still on him, ruling out robbery as a motive. There was no struggle, no defensive wounds. The autopsy concluded that death would have been nearly instantaneous. By the time the body was found days later, decomposition had begun. It was a hunter who stumbled upon the remains. Ted Price was face down in the sand with 4 entry wounds and no explanation. Aaron Gunches wasn't arrested for the murder of Ted Price, at least not initially. In January 2003, 2 months after the killing, Gunches was pulled over by an Arizona state trooper. During the stop, he shot the officer and fled the scene. The officer survived, and Gunches was captured days later. Ballistic testing linked the gun used in the trooper shooting to the bullets recovered from Ted Price's body. Additionally, cell tower data and witness testimony placed Gunches with Price on the day of the murder. The acquaintance who drove with them agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. Faced with mounting forensic evidence, Gunches pleaded guilty to both murder and kidnapping. But was the murder truly premeditated or improvised under pressure from someone else? In 2004, Gunches pleaded guilty to the murder of Ted Price. He represented himself throughout most of the legal proceedings. In 2008, a jury sentenced him to death. That sentence was overturned 2 years later by the Arizona Supreme Court due to procedural errors related to the aggravating factors. In 2013, during a new sentencing phase, Gunches again waived legal counsel and chose not to present any mitigating evidence. He told the jury he accepted responsibility and was again sentenced to death. Over the years, Gunches repeatedly requested his execution be expedited, calling it long overdue. In 2022, he filed a motion asking for a death warrant. Though a scheduled execution in 2023 was halted by Arizona Governor Katie Hobbs for a review of death penalty procedures, the state resumed executions in 2025. On February 11, 2025, the Arizona Supreme Court issued a new warrant. Was his self-representation a rejection of the system, or a calculated acceptance of guilt? For his final meal, Aaron Gunches requested a double Western bacon cheeseburger with fries, 1 spicy gyro, 1 barbecue gyro, a side of onion rings, and baklava for dessert. The selection reflected indulgence rather than sentiment, comfort food with no symbolic references. Witnesses confirmed that Gunches consumed the full meal without hesitation and made no unusual requests beyond the food itself. There were no dietary restrictions, spiritual preferences, or last-minute changes. The meal was eaten in silence, consistent with his emotionally restrained behavior in the hours leading up to the execution. In the final hours of his life, Aaron Brian Gunches showed no resistance, no outward emotion, and no interest in prolonging the process. He had spent years waiving appeals, requesting execution, and representing himself during trial proceedings. According to prison staff, his demeanor remained consistent, silent, stable, and cooperative. He did not request a spiritual advisor. He made no final phone calls. No family members visited. There was no religious ritual, letter, or personal message submitted before death. Witnesses described him as calm and alert while being moved to the execution chamber at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence. He walked without assistance and did not speak to staff or officials during the final protocol. At approximately 10 a.m., he was strapped onto the execution gurney. He complied fully with IV placement and showed no visible signs of distress. When asked if he had any final words, Gunches shook his head once, without speaking. At 10:25 a.m., the lethal injection began. The drug used was pentobarbital, administered through a single IV line. Within seconds, his chest rose and fell with several deep breaths. A few moments later, witnesses reported snoring-like sounds, described by some as labored breathing. He then became still. The execution team noted no complications. Gunches was pronounced dead at 10:33 a.m. Outside observers later raised the possibility that the snoring and respiratory irregularities could have been signs of pulmonary edema, a condition that causes fluid to accumulate in the lungs and may result in a sensation of drowning. However, the state insisted the procedure followed protocol. While Jesse Dean Hoffman's case marked the debut of a controversial new method, the next execution returned to a more familiar, yet no less contested, procedure. On March 20, 2025, after nearly 17 years on death row, Wendell Arden Grissom was executed by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester for a home invasion murder that left one woman dead and another seriously wounded. On November 3, 2005, 23-year-old Amber Dawn Matthews was at a friend's house in Watonga, Oklahoma, helping care for an infant. Her friend, Dro Koff, lived in the home with her baby daughter. That afternoon, Wendell Grissom and an acquaintance, Jesse Floyd Johns, a man Grissom had picked up while hitchhiking, were driving around drinking whiskey. At some point, they decided to commit a robbery to get money. They targeted Koff's residence at random. Once inside, Grissom shot Koff multiple times, leaving her seriously wounded but alive. He then moved through the house and found Matthews in another room, holding Koff's infant daughter. According to trial testimony, Matthews posed no threat. Grissom shot her in the face at close range, killing her instantly while she was still holding the child. The baby was unharmed. Grissom and Johns fled in Koff's vehicle. Matthews' body was discovered shortly after by emergency responders. Koff, despite her injuries, survived and later testified. The scene was described as chaotic: blood spatter, a crying infant, and a dead woman clutching the child she had tried to protect. Was this a botched robbery, or something even more senseless? The conviction of Wendell Arden Grissom for the 2005 home invasion murder of Amber Dawn Matthews rested on a convergence of eyewitness testimony, forensic analysis, ballistic evidence, and the defendant's own confession. The most direct evidence came from survivor Dro Koff. Despite being shot multiple times, including in the chest, Koff survived and later identified Grissom as the man who forced his way into her home, opened fire, and fled with her vehicle. Her testimony established a clear sequence. Grissom and his accomplice, Jesse Floyd Johns, entered without warning, shot her during the confrontation, and then murdered Matthews in the next room while she was holding a baby. Physical evidence supported her account. Grissom's fingerprints were recovered from the stolen vehicle, abandoned shortly after the attack. Investigators found a whiskey bottle in the car's interior with partial prints that matched both Grissom and Johns. In addition, items from Kopf's residence were located in the back seat, confirming the car was used as a getaway vehicle and linking Grissom directly to the crime scene. Forensic investigators recovered bullet casings and projectiles from the scene. A .38 caliber revolver, later found in Grissom's possession, was matched to the casings through ballistics testing. The bullets that struck both Matthews and Kopf were fired from this weapon. The trajectory, distance, and grouping of the rounds indicated purposeful, targeted shooting rather than chaotic crossfire. Grissom confessed to the murder during police interrogation, admitting that he shot both women but claiming he did not understand what compelled him to do it. He cited alcohol and not being in his right mind, but gave no strategic defense. His co-defendant, Johns, corroborated key aspects of the crime in exchange for a plea deal, confirming that Grissom was the one who pulled the trigger. Grissom was charged with first-degree murder, shooting with intent to kill, grand larceny, and unlawful possession of a firearm. Prosecutors emphasized the random, unprovoked, and violent nature of the crime. Amber Matthews had been unarmed, holding an infant, and had no opportunity to defend herself. The defense admitted Grissom's responsibility, but cited long-term alcohol and substance abuse, as well as possible neurological impairment, as mitigating factors. Psychological evaluations indicated frontal lobe dysfunction and impulsivity, but the jury found these explanations insufficient. In 2008, Grissom was sentenced to death. In post-conviction proceedings, his attorneys introduced new evidence of previously undiagnosed brain damage. Several jurors later stated that, had they known about these findings, they might have reconsidered the death penalty, but appeals were denied at both the state and federal levels. In February 2025, the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board voted 4-1 to deny clemency. For his last meal, Wendell Grissom requested a Canadian Bacon Supreme pizza, a pint of vanilla ice cream, and a pint of Coca-Cola. There were no unusual food requests or symbolic items. He ate alone, quietly and without comment. On the morning of the execution, he was escorted from his holding cell to the death chamber without protest. He walked unassisted, did not speak to staff, and made no eye contact with witnesses. He declined to have a spiritual advisor present. Once inside the execution chamber, Grissom was secured to the gurney. 4 lines were placed without incident. He remained still, his breathing steady. When given the opportunity to make a final statement, he addressed the family of Amber Matthews with a controlled voice. "I apologize to all of you that I've hurt. I regret so much that I've put that hatred in your heart for me. I pray that you all can forgive me, not for my sake, for your sake." No further words were spoken. He did not cry. He did not resist. He kept his eyes closed as the execution team began the process. At 10:03 a.m., the first of 3 drugs was administered. By 10:08 a.m., Grissom was declared unconscious. He was pronounced dead at 10:13 a.m. There were no irregular movements, complications, or signs of distress observed. He died expressing regret. But after 17 years, did the remorse come too late? Or was it always there, buried under silence? One day later, the cycle continued, this time in neighboring Oklahoma, with another lethal injection carried out under far less public scrutiny. On March 18, 2025, after nearly 29 years on death row, Jesse Dean Hoffman Jr. was executed by nitrogen hypoxia at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola, becoming the first person in the U.S. to die by this method. On a November evening in 1996, 28-year-old Mary Molly Elliott, a systems analyst and well-known member of her church, parked her car in a downtown New Orleans garage. Surveillance footage later captured her exiting an elevator and walking to her vehicle, alone. That was the last time she was seen alive. Jesse Dean Hoffman, then 18, was already inside the parking structure. He was not targeting Elliott specifically. His motive, as later described by prosecutors, was opportunistic violence, initiated as a robbery but quickly evolving into something far more calculated. At gunpoint, Hoffman forced Elliot into his car and drove her to a nearby ATM. There, under duress, she withdrew $200 and handed it to him. She complied. There was no resistance. At this point, the threat could have ended, but it didn't. Instead of fleeing, Hoffman drove her over 50 miles away to a wooded area in rural St. Tammany Parish. The location was remote, undeveloped, and unlit, far from any chance of witness intervention. It was not the act of someone panicking, it was the behavior of someone who wanted total control. There, he raped her. The forensic report indicated signs of vaginal trauma, and DNA evidence confirmed the assault. No condom was used. There was no attempt to conceal the crime scene afterward. Then came the execution. Hoffman took a handgun and fired one bullet into Elliot's head at close range. The entrance wound was behind the ear. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, suggesting that she may have been kneeling, possibly begging, or already incapacitated. He left her body in the woods, partially covered with leaves, and drove away in silence. 2 days later, her body was found by a hunter. Her clothing was intact, but her expression, according to forensic photographers, was frozen in terror. The bullet had passed through the base of her skull. Death had been nearly instantaneous. Her ID was still in her pocket. No ransom note, no cover story, no attempt to contact the police. Investigators identified Hoffman using multiple forms of evidence. The ATM security footage, DNA recovered from the victim's body. The murder weapon, later linked to Hoffman Elliot's vehicle, which was found abandoned and wiped down, but not completely on. Hoffman was arrested weeks later. Under interrogation, he initially denied involvement, but forensic results contradicted him. His semen was a match. A hair found on the victim's clothing also matched his DNA profile. No one else was ever arrested in connection with the crime. There were no signs of a co-conspirator. His defense presented no alternate suspect theory. Was it an impulsive act of violence, or premeditated from the start? In September 1998, a jury found Jesse Hoffman guilty of first-degree murder. The prosecution painted him as a predator, young, violent, and without remorse. They emphasized the sequence: kidnapping, financial exploitation, rape, and murder as a pattern of deliberate cruelty. The defense did not contest the timeline but argued for mitigation. Hoffman had grown up in an abusive home, beaten and neglected. His attorneys called clinical psychologists who testified that he showed signs of dissociation and severe trauma, which may have affected his ability to form intent or recall events clearly. Despite these arguments, the jury sentenced him to death. His appeal spanned over 2 decades and included challenges to the constitutionality of his death sentence and the method of execution. In early 2025, his legal team filed an emergency appeal arguing that nitrogen hypoxia would interfere with Hoffman's Buddhist spiritual practices. The appeal was rejected in a 5-4 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court. Did the courts weigh his past, or only his crime? In the final hours leading up to his execution on March 18, 2025, Jesse Hoffman showed no outward signs of panic, aggression, or resistance. According to prison officials, he was quiet, calm, and cooperative throughout the process. His behavior was described as resigned, not defiant, suggesting psychological preparation rather than emotional numbness. He declined the offer of a special last meal. He did not request music, reading material, or any unusual comforts. Instead, he spent his final hours in silent meditation with his chosen spiritual advisor, a Buddhist chaplain who remained with him until the end. Hoffman's legal team had previously argued that nitrogen hypoxia would interfere with his religious rituals, but those appeals were denied. There were no reported conversations with staff or final outreach to the victim's family. He did not speak to the press and issued no last-minute legal filings. He had no visitors beyond spiritual counsel. The lack of outward emotion was interpreted by some as spiritual discipline. Others described it as emotional detachment. At 6:30 p.m., he was escorted without resistance into the execution chamber at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He lay down on the gurney voluntarily and allowed staff to strap him in. No sedatives were administered. A full-face mask was placed over his head and sealed at the edges. The nitrogen gas began flowing moments later. Witnesses described an initial stillness, followed by sporadic chest movements and shallow gasping. At approximately 6 minutes in, mild convulsions began, consistent with the onset of hypoxia-induced loss of consciousness. At minute 9, Hoffman appeared completely motionless. He was pronounced dead at 6:50 p.m. That same day, nearly 1,000 miles away, Florida carried out its own execution. This one rooted in a decades-old case involving the murder of a child and her grandmother. On March 20, 2025, after nearly 3 decades on Florida's death row, Edward Thomas James, 63, was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison in Stark for the 1993 murders of 8-year-old Toni Neuner and her grandmother, 58-year-old Betty Dick. The events unfolded on September 19, 1993, in Cocoa Beach, Florida. Edward James was a tenant in the home of Betty Dick, a 58-year-old retiree. That night, Betty was caring for her 8-year-old granddaughter, Toni Neuner, who had come to spend the weekend. James had spent the evening drinking heavily and ingesting LSD. At some point in the early morning hours, he returned to the house under the influence. Inside that residence, over a period of hours, James committed 2 of the most disturbing acts of violence the community had seen. According to investigators, James entered Toni's bedroom. Occurred. The child was later found lifeless in her bed, with physical trauma that raised immediate red flags to responding officers. Moments later, James confronted Betty Dick in another part of the home. Armed with a sharp object, he stabbed her multiple times. The medical examiner later confirmed that many of the wounds were defensive, suggesting she had attempted to fight back. Her body was found near the living room area. After the killings, James gathered valuables, including jewelry, and fled the scene in Dick's car. He crossed state lines, ultimately traveling to California. It was a neighbor who alerted authorities the following morning after noticing the front door ajar and receiving no response. Police entered the house and discovered the 2 victims. A stolen car alert and forensic processing quickly linked James to the scene. What began as intoxicated recklessness became a prolonged legal battle that would span 3 decades. James was arrested on October 6, 1993 in Bakersfield, California, after a tip from America's Most Wanted. During questioning, he gave a detailed account of the night, including specific information about the home layout, sequence of events, and the items taken, details only the perpetrator would know. Forensic evidence confirmed his presence. Biological material at the scene matched James. His fingerprints were recovered from the child's bedroom door and from inside the vehicle used to flee the state. There were no conflicting eyewitness accounts, no alternate suspects. The combination of physical evidence, confession, and behavioral flight closed the case tightly. The evidence spoke clearly, yet the motive remained murky, buried beneath intoxication, impulse, and silence. In 1995, Edward James pleaded guilty to all charges, including 2 counts of first-degree murder, along with related charges of child endangerment, kidnapping, and theft. A penalty phase was held separately. The jury voted 11-1 in favor of a death sentence. James was formally sentenced to death on August 18, 1995. Over the next 30 years, James's legal team pursued multiple avenues of appeal. Their arguments centered on mental health, citing long-term drug abuse, past head trauma, and a heart attack in 2024 that allegedly caused neurological impairment. Independent evaluations found signs of cognitive decline and frontal lobe damage, conditions associated with impaired judgment and lack of emotional control. Despite these claims, courts at every level, including the U.S. Supreme Court, denied relief. In February 2025, Governor Ron DeSantis signed the death warrant, setting the execution for March 20th. Edward James requested fried catfish, hush puppies, potato salad, cookies, soda, and coffee. He consumed the meal without comment and made no symbolic requests. He ate quietly and alone. In the final 24 hours of his life, Edward Thomas James displayed no visible emotional response. According to staff at Florida State Prison, his behavior was quiet, cooperative, and emotionally neutral. There were no disruptions, outbursts, or expressions of fear. He neither spoke of remorse nor challenged the execution process in any way. James had no visitors in the hours leading up to the execution. He declined spiritual counsel, made no written statement, and did not request contact with family or the victim's relatives. He spent most of the day in silence and alone in his cell, under observation. Officials reported that he accepted his final meal without comment and consumed it fully. He showed no appetite for delay, legal intervention, or spiritual closure. At 8 p.m., he was brought into the execution chamber. He walked without assistance and remained physically calm as he was secured to the gurney. His breathing was steady, his gaze was fixed straight ahead. When asked if he had any final words, James gave a single shake of his head. No. No prayers, no apologies, no declarations. At 8:05 p.m., the first drug was administered. Observers noted that James began breathing heavily. His arms flinched once, then fell still. His facial expression did not change. No sounds were made. By 8:08 p.m., he was unresponsive. He was pronounced dead at 8:15 p.m. He faced death in silence, whether from remorse, resignation, or emotional vacancy remains unanswered. That concludes all executions carried out in March 2025. Which case shocked you the most?